Welcome to our session entitled From Refugee Voices to Next Generation Voices. My name is Dr. Bea Lewkowicz and I'm the co-founder and director of the AGR Refugee Voices Archive. I'm also second generation. My parents survived the war as young teenagers in Poland and Slovakia, my mother in hiding, my father in 6 concentration camps. In this session, I'd like to introduce you to the AGR Refugee Voices Archive and then tell you about our new oral history initiative, which involves interviewing second and third generations of Holocaust survivors and refugees. We will then be joined by 2 second-generation women, Susie, Kaufman and Helen Sterne, who will discuss with me the histories of their parents and the impact this history had on their own lives. And they were interviewed by us now for our new project. As many of you know, we founded the AGR Refugee Voices Archive in 2003. It was the first British video Holocaust testimony collection. And I'm proud to say that today, 18 years later, it consists of nearly 260 video interviews, life histories. They don't only focus on the Holocaust, it's an entire life story, with Holocaust survivors and refugees who settled in Britain. And they also consist of an extensive archive of around 4,000 photographs and documents captured at the end of the interviews. Until recently, only the first 150 interviews were accessible at our partner institutions, but I'm happy to say that a few months ago, the Wiener Holocaust Library was the first institution to receive a new hard drive with 250 interviews. And in the next few months, our other partner organizations worldwide will also receive the new collections of interviews, and they will also get access to all the transcripts, which is very exciting. And I'd like to thank the Refugee Voices team for their hard work of getting us to this stage. The theme of this AGR forum is reconnecting the next generation. And in preparation for today, I asked myself how the next generations were represented in the Refugee Voices interviews we conducted. And there are 2 aspects to this answer, and I just want to discuss them briefly. First, whenever children or other family members were present at the end of an interview, and I should say that didn't happen often, but it did happen and time allowed it, I tried to film a short interaction between the interviewee and mostly their children, which I found very moving. I will show you some of these examples shortly. In a rare instance, something else happened at the end of an interview. For example, when I interviewed the pianist Maria Litka, I was lucky to film her play the violin, not the pianist, the violinist Maria Litka. I was lucky to film her play the violin, accompanied on the piano by her son Simon May. The second point, the importance of children and grandchildren, and also their achievements, is something which comes through in many interviews. The theme of raising children and communicating about the past to the children and grandchildren is also discussed in many interviews. And of course, we can find a range of behavior reported by the interviewees, with some saying they never spoke about the past to anyone, and others saying they were happy to speak to their children. When I interviewed the illustrator and author Judith Joy in 2001, whose book When Hitler Stole Pink Rabbit was published exactly 50 years ago, she made it very clear that the reason why she wrote the book and the subsequent 2 autobiographical books was because she wanted her children and her husband to understand where she came from and what she had experienced. She says, I quote her here, "They wanted to know what it was like, so I wrote this book When Hitler Stole Pink Rabbit. I think it was for my husband as much as my children. I think I wanted him to know what it was like as much as telling the children exactly what happened." It would be really interesting in the future to analyze in detail how the interviewees narrate the themes of creating a family and raising children. And I hope that some researchers are going to look at this in more detail. And the last point I'd like to make is that I'd like to suggest that in the context of many testimonies, children represent the future in contrast to the painful past. They also represent hope and normality. And I remember from personal experience listening from the room next door when my mother was interviewed for the Shoah Foundation many years ago, when she said to the interviewer, quote, "The day my daughter was born was the happiest day in my life." Another interviewer talked about the notion of anchoring and grounding when discussing her daughter. And there are many other examples. Sometimes children also represent a successful integration. Ludwig Spiro, the former AGR treasurer, for example, told me that he felt well respected as a Jewish refugee from Germany, but, quote, that his children consider themselves largely British and would not want anything else. And mind you, this was before Brexit happened. Many things have changed since we began interviewing. The children and grandchildren of our interviewees became older, the political landscape in Britain and the world changed considerably. After 18 years of oral history with the first generation, it seems the perfect time to look at the next generations and find out how they have engaged with the inherited history of the previous generation and investigate the impact this history had on their lives. With the support of the AGR Next Generation Committee, we embarked on our first interviews in the last few months, mostly on Zoom, but are now hoping to conduct in-person interviews. It seems that many people would like to be interviewed, and you can see some excerpts from these interviews on our website. As Rabbi Charlie Baginski mentioned yesterday, it is now time for the second generation to intentionally remember, so that future generation can pick up the torch. So we hope that the interviews can be part of this intentional remembering process, and that we can give a space to the voices of the next generations. Based on the interviews so far, we feel that it is important for the next generations who feel, quote, they are part of history too, or they would like to honor the dead and show that they're not forgotten. And they also pointed out, quote, it is important to record this for the future when the present is beyond memory. If you're interested to be interviewed, to become an interviewer, or just to become involved, please get in touch with me. But let us now watch an 8-minute film cut together from 3 first-generation and 1 third-generation interview with the actor Ed Skrein, who some of you might know from Games of Thrones. The first-generation interviewees are Ruth Danson, who emigrated to the UK with her brother and parents from Breslau, Freddie Stern, who came on the Kindertransport from Montabaur, and Valerie Klimt, who had emigrated with her mother in April 1939 to India and came to the UK in 1948. I had chosen these clips for you because I remembered the conversations with the children at the end of the interviews. To my utter amazement, I discovered a few days ago that Freddie Stern and Ruth Danson came on the same ship to England. They sailed on the 22nd of March 1939 on the luxury ocean liner, the SS Manhattan, from Hamburg to Southampton. Freddie Stern was one of the 88 unaccompanied children who embarked the ship in Hamburg. And I should say the only Kindertransport group which traveled in that way. And then, once we've watched the film, we will pick up some of the themes discussed in the film in our discussion with Susie Kaufman and Helen Sterne. Thank you.
My daughter, and this is my son.
And who's your favourite, would you say?
Perfect. So I just want to say thank you again for your interview. And since you're here, what I'd like to ask you, how you think the experience of your mother has shaped your life, or whether it was the past has sort of been a topic and maybe has come back more or less, or
I think the past has always been very important to my mother, particularly because of her very good memory and the fact that our grandmother lived with us, so it was and who was also directly affected by everything. So that has always, the history of our family has always been part of our everyday life, and my mother has been a loyal custodian of all the fallen relatives, which is how I think it should be. And she's taught us the importance of remembering our relatives and everything that happened.
So, and I don't know, I think as regards her migration, it was just, this is by chance, but it was a very good preparation for the life that we've come to experience in Britain. India, 9 years in India, was always in the background, and it was a very fond time for my mother. So fond stories of India.
And generally, I think it was because of the different countries that both my parents had lived in. It was a sort of cosmopolitan upbringing because we had sort of exposure to lots of different cultures and cultural influences.
And it was great having German in the background because we always had a secret code.
Yeah.
We could laugh about people without them realising. That was very, very practiced, wasn't it? When we went to places, all the comments about people that we wanted to keep secret were in German when we were out.
And did you all speak German? I'm quite
Yes,
surprised.
because of my grandmother who lived with us, and we spoke. It's fair to say my grandmother, she was a wonderful woman, but she was not a linguist. And she if there was a mistake to be made in the language, she used to make it. Just as one example, the favourite probably the example, she was reading an article in the newspaper about Bing Crosby, and she came into my mother and she said in German that Bing Crosby is saying that people think he's wealthy, but he isn't that wealthy because he's given it all to his uncle. And my mother sort of looked at the article, and Bing Crosby had said, "I haven't got much money left. Uncle Sam's got it all." but so my grandmother spoke German to us, and so we learnt German without us even knowing that we were learning a second language. So we were, at that time, we were sort of more or less bilingual.
Right.
This is my son. He's Gerald Stern, and he was born on the 28th of May 1955, and he's my only son, and I have a daughter as well.
Okay. Thank you. Gerald, you've listened to your father's testimony. Is there anything you'd like to add?
Well, just that growing up, I suppose that this whole issue was always the elephant in the room. We had grandparents on my mother's side, none on my father's side. And I remember my bar mitzvah when my father stood up to speak and became very upset because he remembered his own bar mitzvah. And I was asked about family and was told that they were all killed.
The lady on my left is my lovely daughter, Jacqueline Ann Danson. And the gentleman on my right is my lovely nephew, Peter Boswell.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So I'd like to ask you both, Jacqueline and Peter, you've been listening in to these interviews. Is there anything you would like to comment or add to your answer to your mother's story? Jacqueline, would you like to start?
Sure. I would first of all like to say how proud I am to be part of your community, and I would also like to say that for all the dreadful events of the war, something good has come of it, because I would not be your child if it were not for that.
True.
And so I'm very grateful for that, and I'm very grateful for my being completely as if I were a biological child, have been brought into your wonderful community, which is a huge privilege. And to add to what you were saying about our view of German and Germany, I very much consider myself part German, and that's because of the wonderful aspects of Germany. That they weren't all wonderful, but there's the culture, the food and the language, and you've brought me up with those, and they're part of who I am, and I'm very proud of that. I'm proud to be the daughter, adopted daughter, the same as a biological daughter of German Jewish parents and wonderful people such as you and Daddy. So,
Ruth, is there anything you'd like to say to your daughter?
Thank you all, not only my daughter and my Peter here, my nephew, also for you that you took this enormous trouble to take my story
Thank you,
onto
we appreciate
the AJR.
it. It means a
I
lot.
really think that is fantastic.
My grandmother came over on Kindertransport in 1939 from Vienna. She left her family and came over. She met another political refugee from Vienna, who she didn't know in Vienna, but was actually from a couple of miles away. George Sterne, who was my grandfather, they met at a Austrian club and fell in love and got married and had my father. And so the Second World War, the Holocaust, was always something which was very present in our family, although something that was not spoken about, at least with my grandparents. But you could always feel the shadow of it, and it was something that me and my brothers and sisters were kind of fascinated with when we were in school and we were learning about the Second World War. We knew we had this personal family connection to it. We just didn't really know the details. And we would go round, and when we'd have dinner, we would ask them. My grandfather would speak more about it, but they would never speak in personal terms.
Okay, it's working. We are running slightly late, so without further ado, I'd like to thank you for joining me today. And I'll introduce you briefly. Susie Kaufman is the daughter of 2 refugees from Germany. She was born in 1954 and grew up in Newcastle. She married Andrew Kaufman, current chairman of the AGR, and raised 2 children. She started to volunteer for the AGR New Day Centre in 1986 and was appointed to manage the AGR kitchen and recommenced the Meals on Wheels service in the AGR. Everyone knows Susie very well. And in 1998 she was appointed a magistrate to the Harrow bench. Helen Stern, on my left, is the daughter of refugees who came to Britain from Czechoslovakia in 1939, having got out at the last moment after the Germans invaded. The family was a secular one, and Helen only learned that she was Jewish at the age of 11. Since retiring from a career in education, she has spent considerable time and energy researching and writing about what happened to members of her family. So thank you, Susie and Helen, for talking to me today and for having participated in the Next Generation Voices project. Both of you have very different experiences. Susie grew up within the Jewish refugee community and Helen did not, and I'm sure many of you in the audience and on Zoom will be able to identify with these very different experiences. So my first question I'd like to ask you is to tell us a little bit about your childhood and the wider family or lack of family you experienced. Maybe Susie, we'll start with you. Just speak like that. Yeah.
Well, as Bea has mentioned, I came from quite a traditional Jewish family, but on one hand I went to the French convent. A lot of the girls from Newcastle did that. It was supposedly a good school, it actually wasn't. My Hebrew education was at the girls' seminary in Gateshead, so I really went from one extreme to another. But I did always feel quite different from my English Jewish friends and, of course, from English friends. We were quite, in fact, very German at home. And I didn't find it difficult. My paternal grandmother actually spoke German to myself and my cousin, because she said, one day you'll be very pleased that this is what happened, and I was.
Thank you for the time. Helen, what about you?
Right, so I also grew up in the north of England, but as Bea's already mentioned, I had no sense of being Jewish until I was past 10, age 11 actually. I remember quite clearly when it was explained to me that, I mean, I'd always known that my family was not English, that where they came from, but I was too young to question what it was all about. And so my awareness of what it meant and so on, it's something that grew on me gradually over the years, really. And my family were not part of the Jewish community really in Sheffield, although we did have friends who were Jewish who had got similar backgrounds. But I never went to a synagogue. I didn't grow up with any of the cultural traditions and so on. That, of course, didn't prevent me from wanting to know all about it as the years went by. And really that's something that's grown on me more and more as the years have gone on. Is that enough?
Yeah, thank you. I think it brings us to the next, to the big theme in all the interviews is what was talked about and how was the history discussed. And I think that's what Ed Skrein said. It was always an abstract term, something I can relate to. My parents talked about it, but not showing me the pictures, not too concretely. Maybe both of you, how was the history discussed and transmitted?
In fact, my two grandmothers never spoke about the experiences in Germany, other than when they were packing to leave, and they were packing the lift, which is a container, and they had a member of the Gestapo in the apartment with them watching her pack. And she picked up an item and she said, "Am I allowed to take this?" And he said, "Not really, but I'm going off to lunch now, so I'll see you this afternoon." So that was about the only story she ever told about life. But my mother talked about her feelings because she was only 8 years old at the time of the Kristallnacht. And she witnessed beating of their family doctor that night and often talked about certain things, but other than that, no.
Thank you. Helen.
Well, I suppose one of the first things that hit home to me was, I don't know, I think maybe I was about 13, and I found my mother crying behind the bedroom door. And she had had the news that her very close friend from home, who was Jewish, who had survived the war in Yugoslavia, but unfortunately had now died of cancer, and so they would never be reunited. And it was a shock to me to see my mother, who was my rock, in that state. And so that's a memory that's always stayed with me. But still, you know, at that age, the sort of emotional impact takes a while to grow on you. The next thing that happened for me was when our family went back to make a return to Czechoslovakia in 1967. And again, I was still quite young, but it was that sense of, you know, trying to understand what was happening for my parents, that they had, there was nobody there, none of that world they had known, it was all gone. Very few people still to be found. And then, you know, going to a cemetery where my mother's father was buried and was overgrown, nothing there. Then going to the Pinkas synagogue in Prague, which at that stage still had all the names on the walls, and seeing both my parents in tears about, you know, their relatives' names on the wall. And for me, you know, I was in my teens, but it sort of began to sink in a little bit about what was happening to my parents. Well, I'm trying to sort of connect with what you wanted to know, really. How the history was talked about. How history was talked about. So yeah, I mean, not really explicitly. It was never, you know, it was never don't ask me those questions, but it was also never really brought up. There were things like my mother read books about it, but in secret, so that, because I remember my father coming across her one time and sort of scolding her for sort of tormenting herself. But, you know, it wasn't that there was a wall of silence, but I think it was just really, my take on it now, thinking about it, is that it was just impossible for them to talk about. I mean, there was no post-traumatic stress counselling or anything in those days. I mean, you know, it was so enormous and so huge that they had to look to the future. They probably would have just unravelled if they'd started to unpick it all. And they also wanted to protect us, and that's my feeling about it. It wasn't a deliberate sort of covering up, but it was too difficult to talk about. That's how I look at it.
Thank you. And Susie, you mentioned briefly already the issue of language, in your case German. Just tell us a little bit about it.
Well, my parents used to speak German so that we wouldn't understand anything. My grandmother, as I said, only spoke German. My maternal grandmother, her English was never very good, so she was much happier speaking German. And in fact, my paternal grandfather went back to Germany after the war, so we spent a lot of time in Frankfurt, actually. So it was there all the time.
Yeah, and you speak it?
And I speak it.
And what did your parents, did they speak Czech or German?
Well, my mother was from the Sudetenland, so she, you know, Czech was a second language to her. German was her first language, and you know, she never really felt at home in Czech. My father spoke it because he was from Prague. But yeah, I heard German in my childhood with the very few relatives that were still there, and I then learned it at school. But it's not, I mean, it's only, English was the language we spoke at home, and my parents, I think, you know, they came from that community of assimilation was the thing, and that's what they wanted to do when they came here as well. It was about assimilation, and they wanted us to not go through what they'd gone through. So, yeah.
And then you told me that then it suddenly changed for you, and you did lots of research to find out more. What was the turning point for you?
Well, really, actually, over the years, I've done, you know, I had a relationship with a man when I was in my 20s who was a historian who started to ask me questions about my family and said, you know, your family's very interesting, you should find out more about it. And then I actually did interview my mother and my step-grandmother and my uncle in the 80s about wanting to know more. But, you know, I wasn't a very sophisticated interviewer, and I didn't always know what questions to ask, and they, you know, so, but it's still interesting. And one of the things that I do remember from my step-grandmother, who was ethnic German, actually, my father's stepmother, when I asked her, she had been in Prague right through, and she'd seen my other grandmother being deported, and she couldn't talk about it. I mean, I got the recording, and she just, I listened to it, and you know, I asked her what happened, and she just is too emotional to talk about it. Even then, it was 40 years after the war, you know. But then, obviously, other things have happened since, and there was this discovery of my grandmother's letters, my grandmother who was deported more recently, and that has, you know, opened up a huge amount of information about how things were, which I'm obviously very grateful to have. And set me off on a sort of trail of research as well.
Thank you. And so you've been living this heritage for all your life, so how do you think that it impact your choices?
I think quite a lot, actually. Firstly, with the husband I chose, who in fact said to me, he would only marry somebody who knew what pumpernickel was and could spell it. And in fact, his line of the law was dealing with German, Austrian and Swiss clients. And so we travelled extensively for, well, nearly 50 years in German-speaking countries. So, you know, it really worked out very well. So my grandmother's words of, one day you'll be pleased to have spoken German, because we really didn't want to speak it, in the 60s and 50s, was true, and it worked out very well.
Thank you. Many more questions. Unfortunately, our time is running out, so I'd like to finish with this issue about being interviewed and refer to something Jonathan said this morning, that often people get interested once their parents are not there, and whether actually giving interview as a second generation, you know, does it raise issues of confidentiality, of feeling disloyal to your parents if you challenge their narrative, and, you know, what you felt when you were actually being interviewed and shared your story with us?
I can't say that I felt I was being disloyal, really, and I had a very sympathetic interviewer who was very, you know, sensitive with questions, and I think I felt a little bit, there was one of the speakers yesterday, I think it's Lisa Hipkin, said something about coming out of the shadows, and I remember that phrase because I felt a little bit like that about doing the interviews, about coming out of the shadows. But I feel, I think like probably many people here, that it's so important. It's not just about you know, the just bald fact of the events that happened, but it's the broader and more in-depth understanding of how these things came about, that I'm, you know, concerned that we preserve that memory, and so that's my contribution in a small way, I hope, to that.
So you see this as the legacy of being second generation.
Yeah.
And Susie?
Well, I think I felt very privileged to be asked to give my testimony. I didn't feel disloyal at all, because everything that I said were things that my, you know, mother had told me, and there was nothing controversial really. And really, I want to thank Bea for taking my testimony, because it is important. I feel it is vital, especially with what we've heard over the last 2 days at this conference about anti-Semitism and people doubting that the Holocaust really happened. We need to go on, and I think our children need to be the next people after us. When the first generation are no longer, I'm very happy to take the baton, but I think after that we need to train the next generation to do the same.
Thank you. I think I should clarify what I meant by disloyal is, of course, not when you tell the story, but maybe sometimes sharing a theme which a parent might have been uncomfortable with, which they wouldn't have talked about. Because as we know, my mother also, you know, the outside world was seen as dangerous, so that certain things you certainly do not discuss in public. So that's what I meant. I would like to thank you. I'm really sorry we don't have more time. There's so much more to discuss, and I think it will make us think, you know, how we can carry the legacy forward. And I'm looking forward to hearing more testimonies from the second generation, and to think what we can do to influence the third generation. And maybe just to finish with a personal story, my children, who are now sort of older teenagers, one of my middle child was taken to a trip to Germany, and of course my children have grown up with quite a few stories from my parents, and they see my work, and they were taken first to Berlin and then to Poland. That was the trip, and you know, it was a very good trip, very well organized. They had, you know, they were in Auschwitz, and my son came back home, and he brought home a football shirt from Germany, a German football shirt. So I thought that was quite interesting, because in my generation that would have been, I wouldn't have bought a German football shirt, but he did. So I think it's going to be interesting to see what the next generation will do with this legacy. So thank you very much, and thank you, and thank you, Susie.